This is Crimson 60620. Thank you for watching my video. Also, you can catch me on these social media platforms. And if you want to hit my DeviantArt page up. And finally, support my Patreon. Thanks. All right. Great. So, what's up, everybody? This is me, Crimson 60620, and I am here. I am fucking here. All right, so let's just get a couple things out the way. One, it was awesome that I was able to stream so much on the fucking Thanksgiving, and quite frankly, guys, I enjoyed everybody who was on the stream with me. The Friday after Thanksgiving, I did actually have to go to work, so I didn't. It was like for 5 hours, and after I got off work, I was like, "Fuck it, I'm ready to go home and just chill." And so it came Saturday. Saturday, I spent a wonderful day with a friend of mine. It was fucking awesome. And Saturday evening, I was on the Utah Outcast show. It was like a fun experience. And today, again, I was just gaming, doing some regular shit. And I know. I'm using the game as a backdrop to fucking talk about my political or philosophical beliefs or things of that nature. So, yeah. I'm sending out this invitation and welcome to anybody who feels that they want to actually have a discussion or a conversation with me. Where is my thrall? Could have sworn I had an extra thrall or some shit. Anyway, anybody who wants to have a discussion with me, that thrall, oh my god. What the hell is that thrall? Let's look at my event lineup. Anyway, one of the things that I do always welcome, and I lost the thrall. I'm pissed. It was a fucking relic on the thrall. Oh well. Wait, no, that was a thrall with the fucking big ass sword. Okay, I'm kind of pissed. Anyway, I do this simply put because I'm just trying to make sure that I have a backdrop to talk about different shit. So let's continue. Let's actually talk about Professor Wolff's. I need to look and see when this video was captured. And if you guys want to, oh, this was June. Okay, cool. If you guys want to send me videos that you want to see a comment on, please send me the videos. I have no fucking problem with it. Actually, I will welcome you to send me the videos in case there is any concern that you want to have about the videos that I do. If you want to hear my feedback about some specific question that you may have on videos, yeah, like I am I'm fully okay to give my opinion about shit. All right. So let's actually do this video, and we would actually see from here. So let's continue. Start.
Please welcome Richard Wolff to Google.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all for spending time a little bit with me. Let me tell you exactly what I'm going to do and then try to do it. I want to tell you about the economic system in which you live. And like any object of people trying to figure things out, there have been differences about how to understand economic systems from the beginning. I don't want to bore you by taking you back to any economics class you may remember having had in college. If your experience was like mine, this is a memory you'd rather not bring back, for good reason usually. But if some of it is still in your mind, you may recall that people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Karl Marx and John Stuart Mill and John Keynes and a whole lot of other people whose names you've probably heard all tried to analyze the economy, but they ended up, many of them, doing it in radically different ways. And I mean really different. They didn't see the same thing when they looked at the economy. They didn't understand the mechanisms that make it work. They didn't understand in the same way where it was going. That is, it's been a field characterized by fundamental differences. As big a difference.
So when you actually look at economic systems, you see it where people put in their own personal experiences. And that's not a bad thing per se. It's just that it's what you really see. And there are a lot of different fucking ways. And by the way, guys, I think I have a goal in mind today. So you're going to actually see me building towards maybe recruiting more thralls and actually building my base a little bit more. So that's what I'm going to be working on, as well as listening to Professor Wolff. So, and this is actually an hour and a half speech. So let's hear this shit. Let's continue.
Says whether you believe the sun goes around the earth or the other way
What's
around.
up, Pickett?
And many other examples that I could give. And that's never changed. Economics has been what philosophers call an agonistic field, a place in which different ways of understanding the economy contest with one another, fight it out. Some win, some lose, and those losers sometimes come back and win later. Let me give you an example that you may know about. Because of the Great Depression of the 1930s, the confidence in the capitalist system being able to solve its problems as they arose collapsed. From 1929 to 1941,
Thanks for watching, man.
the United
If you
States
haven't done
had
so,
unemployment rates hovering
hit
around 20 to
follow button.
25%. That's 5 or 6 times the unemployment we have now. And what we have now is a problem. Try to imagine that. Those were years, the 1930s, when the total output of goods and services shrank each year from what it was the year before.
So what Professor Wolff is actually going over right now is just some of the shit that happened in the 1930s, the unemployment, the different things that were happening, the climate that we had at that particular time. Is that motherfucker dead? Oh, motherfucker's dead. Anyway, and this is where you see the things like John Maynard Keynes, or you see different schools of philosophy of how to handle the economy. But let's continue.
It's not surprising that people who were living in a capitalist system worked like that raised lots of questions. And then there were those who believed, no, it's okay, it's a temporary thing, nothing to worry about. The system is wonderfully configured in such a way that it can solve its problems, and it will. Just wait. 6 months, a year.
Thank you for the follow, man.
And so on. But there were too many people suffering too much to wait. And one, a brilliant one, a fellow in England named John Maynard Keynes, basically had the courage to stand up and say, this system isn't working. And if we continue to keep our faith in it, despite the fact that it isn't working in obvious ways that we can see every day. He mentioned, by the way, people sleeping in doorways in London, where he was British, people out of work in huge numbers, people whose wages were going down, not up, et cetera, et cetera. He said, if we don't face it, there's going to be a revolution, and we're not going to have any capitalism at all. He liked capitalism, but he felt that letting things be handled by the private sector was self-destructive lunacy. And he developed an analysis which we now call Keynesian economics. But it saw the economy radically different from what preceded it.
So the fun thing about John Maynard Keynes, at first he was a little bit of a hypocrite. In his personal life, not well in his economic life, in his economic philosophy versus his personal life. He was different. But he started to recognize the hypocrisies that he had where and this is probably what led him to the belief of let's stop trying to screw over the poor. One, because the people remember when they don't have food to eat. People remember that shit. And people remember who holds them down. You can only deflect that shit for so long. Yeah, it's a 20-second delay, man. It is a 20-second delay, but that's just something that I set in order because my computer is just like horrible. But so thank you. Um, so with Keynes, he was what people would call a capitalist, and like Professor Wolff was actually saying, he actually exerted the virtues of capitalism because he, as much as he was well to do, especially later in his life, he recognized that you just have to be compassionate with shit, and that's fucking awesome. And he was one of those things. It's like, hey, and I know we went through this on my video I did with Iron Rod talking about it. It's like money is the only fluid that trickles up, because if you give it to poor people, they will spend it, and the rich people will still end up having it, but it at least allow for the poor people to buy what they need. And that's the Keynesian economics that a lot of people actually discount, but it ends up turning out to be one of the main things that helps people. But let's continue. Thank you for watching the time you did, man. Thank you.
And that Keynesian became the dominant economics in the world for most of the period, roughly the 1940s to the 1970s. And then it was all pushed out, and we had a return of what existed before the 1930s. It was almost as if the memory of the Great Depression and all the troubles it had. And by the way, if you're interested,
there's my throw.
John Steinbeck is a good one to read, give you a feeling of the Great Depression if you've never read that, or seen the movies of Grapes of Wrath or Mice and Men. But in the 1970s, it all went the other way. The Keynesians were dethroned, and we started looking at the economy again in a different way. That's the time of Reagan and Thatcher. And the private economy, which had been excoriated for failing in the Great Depression, was suddenly rehabilitated and made the be-all and end-all that would solve everything. 70s.
So, what you see in the 70s and early 80s was that it was a rebranding of what happened is with what happened in the Roaring 20s. Yes, the Roaring 20s was actually fucking awesome for a handful of people, but it ended up destroying the economy, and people The people who lived through that, either being children or the actual people who, you know, were lived through the depression, they passed away. And people forget how bad that situation was. And quite frankly, you see that where once people forget, the business interests who were always hostile towards what happened with the Great Depression, what happened after the Great Depression, excuse me, they just reasserted themselves and say greed is good. Like you actually had the movie Wall Street where you had Gordon Gekko promote greed is good. Never mind who the fuck that hurts. But let's continue.
80s, 90s. It would have continued except in 2008, this capitalist system we live in crashed again. The second time in 75 years. We're talking a major collapse. For those of you who don't follow these things, in the autumn of 2008, September to December, here in New York, we came that close to an economy that would have stopped functioning. By stopped functioning, I mean the kinds of things you don't think can happen, but we came that close.
So, I don't know if he's gonna go into this, and this is only the preamble of his speech. But one of the things that people fail to realize, so, and this is gonna be a little bit in the weeds, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna explain it as a layman, pretty much, but what the economic collapse actually brought was this. Companies had borrowed against each other for so long and so much that they had a lot of perceived value, but the value wasn't really there. You actually saw it with, and surprisingly, just harking back to another video series that I did about Enron, the smartest guy in the room. Companies didn't do the Enron mark to market kind of profit things. And what they did was they did the, and it still is happening now. And that's the scary thing. That's why people say that there is a bubble that's probably going to burst soon. What companies did was they borrowed against perceived value of their company. And thus, they started selling those shares based on perceived value. That's why IPOs are what they are. And that's why they started to become such a high fucking commodity, because it's a perceived value of how much that stock would actually be. Not the true value, but a perceived value. And that's not a good thing. It's not something where it's not. How many can I do? It's not a good thing, because what's end up happening is those perceived values mean nothing. That perceived value of, well, this is how much value this one particular company costs, because most of that shit is just made up. And then people borrow against it. And when they borrow against it, they have nothing to back it up but that perceived value. And with having all of this perceived value, what it does is nothing but inflate the stock value of companies. So more people who own those companies can sell that stock and make more money. And that's what happened with the 2008 financial crash. That's what you see, that it wasn't an over glut of people buying homes that they shouldn't. Yes, some people bought homes they shouldn't have, but what happened was companies did the mark to market. They said, this is going to give me this much profit, and so I'm going to sell it for this much of worth without seeing a dime of that profit. And then they sold it to other companies, and that's what caused a financial crash. Not people were being irresponsible, not that. It literally was companies trying to sell value on a product that wasn't even there. But let's continue.
No milk, no bread, no buses, no nothing. Terrible. We're still in the after effects of that. Here we are almost a decade later. Like the Great Depression, it has raised again the question, gee, what about this economic system? Only now we have to ask it in a different way, and that's really what I want to talk to you about. Because we can't go back and repeat our own history. We can't now say, oh, let's bring the government back in the way Keynes believed you needed to do, fix this capitalist system, manage this capitalist system, because if you leave it to itself, if you leave it to the business community, look what happened in 1929, and look what happened in 2008 again.
So, and this is where I differ with a lot of anarcho communists. This is where I differ because, and I will state this, I like the idea of having a state. And I get it, and I know I actually saw the critiques of it, where people would say, well, we lived in stateless societies, more like nation states and city states, for the longest time. And I actually recognize that. The problem comes where there were people who wanted power themselves, and so they started doing shit to get power for themselves. And so I think that's my critique of a stateless society. Unless it was, I don't want to say, well, it would have to be global. It definitely would have to be global. And with it being global, it would also have to be some sort of a stateless society, but one that actually has representation, where it would be more of a federation. And I think that's what my thing is. It's like, I would like to see a federation of, I have to do that anyway. I would like to see a federation of a society. And I guess those are details that you can actually hammer out in the whole figuring out what that would actually be. But yeah, I think that there should be a government, but more of a referee type versus a, as Professor Wolff actually says it, more of a state capitalist, like state capitalism, because let's admit that's what the Soviet Union was. It was state capitalism with a military and totalitarianism vibe to it. But let's continue.
And these are cataclysms. You read every few weeks now about an election, like the one a couple weeks ago in France, in which the entire society is being roiled around by the consequences of an economic system that isn't working real well and is producing new kinds of political characters. Even here in the United States, we have what at least most of us think of as a pretty weird political scene these days, don't we? And that's not just because a particular fellow got in, it's because of all the conditions that made it possible for him to get in and to do what he's doing. Okay. So let's talk about this capitalist system, remembering that people have always disagreed. The debates were not only between those who loved capitalism and felt it should be handled by the private business community being able to do its thing. Deregulate, let the economy work, versus the Keynesians who loved the system but said in order to make it work, the government has to come in and make things happen, because left to itself, the system collapses like in 29 and 2008.
So that's another thing. A lot of people advocate for anarcho capitalism, the libertarians. And this is such an argument of what it boils down to. A lot of people who faint to be libertarians and want to actually say, get the government out of my this, get the government out of that, but we want to keep conservative social ideas. They're really advocating, and this is my opinion, so I'm going to preface it with that. They're really advocating for might makes right, and I'm going to be the mighty, so you have to fucking listen to me. And that's what I see a lot of these arguments boil down to. Because I'm this, you have to fucking listen to me. And because you have to fucking listen to me, I can say what I want, and I'm going to set up a system where might makes right. And I'm going to be on top because I'm perceived to be the mightiest. And that's what a lot of these libertarian thinkers are. Now, there are some who are anarcho, I guess, what do they call them? Anarcho syndicus, where they feel that there should be state government, but a kind of a situation where it is more of a syndicate, like I was just describing a few minutes ago, obviously. But in reality, a lot of people that don't want any rules are the people that feel that they can get away with shit to oppress other people. And fuck those people. Fuck those people in particular. But let's continue.
Turns out those were not the only two perspectives. There's also a perspective that says the problems of capitalism go far deeper than whether or not there's more or less government intervention. For such people, this whole issue is secondary. What's their point of view? And it's the one I want to present to you a little bit. Their point of view is that if you look at the capitalist system, with or without government intervention, all the key levers of power are in the hands of the people who run that institution, which is now the place where most production of goods and services happens. And that institution is called the corporation, the capitalist corporation. We are discussing this in one of them, aren't we? It is a powerful institution, as you all know. And so this approach says, let's take a look at how it works and see what consequences come from that.
So, and this is like, and I know that, I saw a comment from, my favorite Sondre, Jill, who loves to talk about different things and doesn't understand shit because he's an idiot. The first critique that you hear from a lot of these people who want some sort of get rid of government, they say, well, you using a capitalist property in order to spread your quote unquote dislike of the system, and you're doing this, and how would you benefit from these innovations? And one, a lot of people don't realize the fucking history of the internet and how it wasn't started as, it was started more as a army. The internet started as something that the U.S. Army actually created in order to communicate with troops better. Al Gore was correct. He motherfucking created the internet. And his tacit pushback of, and this is like, oh god, this is a tangent. This is a tangent. It's a passive pushback where Republicans are able to brag and boast of the accomplishments that they did, even if it's a shitty accomplishment, or watch this now, they got into bankrupt 6 times. They're allowed to brag and boast, but anybody that is anywhere near progressive, they're expected to cow down and bow down, to not a toll or a stroll, whatever the fuck the word is, but not brag about their accomplishments that they may have had, because it's braggadocious and it looks bad. You're supposed to be reasonable and, all this other good bullshit. And I'm sorry, that's one of the things that makes Democrats weak. The only time that they are strong and go after people is when they're going after more progressive Democrats. But I digress. But a lot of the interventions that we had, the fucking supercomputer, NASA created that shit because they wanted to make sure that they can send people to the motherfucking space. Or I should say, the computer itself with the vacuum tubes and things of that nature. That was mostly developed, the advancements in that was done by NASA because they wanted to send people in space. But let's continue.
Before I do it, I need to tell you honestly and clearly where this approach comes from, this looking at the organization of production as it is done in a corporation, which is the dominant form of modern capitalism. The origin of this way of thinking is in the hands of critics of capitalism. This point of view comes from people down through a couple of hundred years that capitalism has been the dominant system in the world. It's not very old. Like every other system, slavery, feudalism, any of the others, capitalism has always had people who love it and people who hate it, just about like everything else. Critics, admirers, celebrants, skeptics. And what I'm about to tell you is there's a tradition, which some of you I'm sure know, of criticism of capitalism. It has many contributors, but the name that has come to dominate is the name of Karl Marx. And this is often called Marxian economics in the sense that it's influenced more or less, that varies from individual to individual, by the critical way that Karl Marx developed his analysis of capitalism. I'm not sure whether I should take a moment out to remind you all of who Karl Marx was, but then again, maybe it's worthwhile. Karl Marx was born...
So, I did a little bit of information research on Karl Marx myself a while ago, and I looked at various different sources, and one of them was like, basically he was German. Why does a lot of this shit come from German and British sources, which is heavily Germanic tribe influence, and somewhat, over the history, England has been conquered so many times. I digress. But like these centers of economics, and I guess you can say that because they actually led the world with some of the things that they had, with the economics that they had to do. But yeah. But Marx was, even though I don't exactly 100% agree with some of the things that he espoused, he wasn't born in Russia. He wasn't some Russian creation. He actually saw the ills of what happened with capitalism. So let's continue.
Born in 1818. That's very important because that's the first generation after the French Revolution, and Marx was a tremendous admirer of the French Revolution. the slogans on the banners of the French, liberty, equality, fraternity, those were the three words of that revolution in 1789, were absolutely the love of the whole generation of which Marx was a part. And they all understood the French Revolution pretty much in the same way, that what the French did was to get rid of feudalism, the old system, and bring in capitalism, the new system. And that by doing so, they would bring in liberty, equality, and fraternity. Or to use the modern language, a democratic system. But Marx came a little later. So Marx was able, by the time he becomes a young man, to see about 50 years worth of development of capitalism in Europe. It began in England, moved to France and the Low Countries, and then spread eventually to the whole world. Marx was 50 years in. And he looked around, Western Germany, that's where he was born, France, where he lived a bit, and then in England, where he lived most of his adult life. He looked around, and by the way, it's the England of Dickens, so if you want to understand what he was seeing, remember Oliver Twist.
So that's actually interesting, where if you've read Dickens, almost all of his works were social commentary on how the poor are treated. This would be a good place for it. And quite frankly, people actually think that Christmas Carol is one of those stories where it's about warm holiday feelings and people actually feeling so great to make sure that they help that they reach out and connect with people. That's not what the Christmas story is about. Literally, the Christmas story is about how the rich treat the poor. That's why I kept coming up about the surplus population. That's why I kept coming up. That's why you saw Scrooge in that Ebenezer Scrooge in that being sent to a foster home, or quote unquote foster home, in the beginning of the story, because what that was talking about, what that was really addressing, was the fact that, kids were, in some cases, an inconvenience to their parents, because the parents had to make money, and it was drilled inside of the kids' heads that, hey, it isolated people. The drive to quote unquote make the money isolated people. And then Scrooge himself, he was hurt by this shit, and so he never understood the sense of what family was and how beneficial it was for people. And quite frankly, you saw some of the things that happened with him, and it also talked about the poor. That's why when the Ghost of Christmas Present actually opened up his coat and you saw those representations of the poor and the hungry, that's what that was about. And the reason why, what is the little kid's Tiny Tim, it wasn't the fact that he needed a father figure. No, he was supposed to die because the family couldn't actually help support themselves. He was supposed to die because, people were hurting, and it led to death. Income inequality leads to people suffering and dying. That's why when you see people that say, well, socialism killed this many people, but capitalism does it quietly, and nobody says anything. But let's continue.
The England of his time was certainly capitalist. Feudalism was gone. So was Paris. So was Frankfurt. And Marx acknowledged that. Capitalism was a dynamic, developing system. But where was the liberty, equality, and fraternity? Nowhere. There wasn't any. Again, if you want to see what I mean, read Dickens. He'll describe to you the absence of liberty, equality, and fraternity in 25 ways. Or if you want the French version, Balzac, or Zola, or any of the others who were writing about these periods. So Marx, young radical that he was, from an upper middle class family, educated at the university, which means he's one of the 3 or 4% of the people who had such an education at that time, he drew a conclusion. The French Revolution was wonderful for bringing in capitalism. But capitalism, it turned out, was not the vehicle or the means to bring people liberty, equality, or fraternity. And so his life work was to answer the question, why not? What is it about?
So this is actually interesting and you can say that capitalism is good. It is a better system than feudalism. It is. I would agree with you on that one. But is it the best system to help support other people? Is a system where there has to be a bottom and there has to be a top. I'm not going to make the joke. I'm trying to be more mature today, but there has to be somebody on the bottom and and there have to be a lot of people on the bottom and very few people on the top. Does that encourage camaraderie? Does that encourage brotherhood? Does that encourage compassion? Does that encourage freedom? If you want to go to another part of the country but can't afford to move there, are you truly free to make that decision? But let's continue.
About capitalism in the 19th century, which is when he lived, that prevented it from bringing the liberty, equality, fraternity, democracy, all those wonderful things. And I'm going to tell you his conclusion, and then we're going to go back and see how he got to it and why he got to it. His conclusion was that capitalism was not only unable to bring it, but that capitalism was a fundamental obstacle to ever achieving it. And that therefore, the human race, if it wanted liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy, would have to devise a system other and different from capitalism, or else spend its entire lives bumping up against the limits of a system that cannot allow for, has never allowed for, liberty, equality, fraternity, or democracy. Not really. Okay, so how did Marx get to this? And why am I going to present an analysis of it to you? Well, let's go back to the corporation. That instrument, that institution through which goods and services are produced. Everything Google makes is the product of the Google Corporation, which the Google Corporation makes sure we know, as all other corporations do likewise. It's the institutional form in which the work gets done. The raw materials, the tools, the equipment to produce the output, which is then marketed around the world. That's how it's done.
It takes a certain amount of balls to actually come in the belly of the beast, the den, and say, hey, this system right here is designed to fuck you over. And he is actually at Google. This is a talk at Google. But let's continue.
And in Marx's image, in Marx's head, therein lies the problem. How is that organized? Let's look, he said, closely into this. And then he did. And again, I'm going to save us a lot of time by summarizing what he found and why it's so relevant. His analysis goes something like this. The workplace, the corporation, but by the way, it applies if you're not incorporated, if you're an unincorporated business or a partnership or a family outfit, the analysis applies there too. But since most production in the United States is organized in corporations and more around the world too, that's the appropriate institution for me to focus on. In the corporation, something very interesting happens every day. The key decision makers are two groups of people. One group are the shareholders, the people who literally, in the way capitalism works, own the corporation by owning shares of it. They're literally shares of ownership. Shares, however, are only owned in the main by rich people or by a few institutions. To give you just one statistic here from the United States, 1% of shareholders own about 2/3 of the shares. If you ever wonder who the 1% are that folks talk about, that's as good a group as any. They are the major shareholders, we call them in economics.
All right, so if you actually, that's interesting. That's interesting to actually see, because here's the thing: a lot of the problems that happen with capitalism isn't the fact that, yes, we have issues where you have it where people would. Hold on, guys. Hold on. All right, sorry about that, guys. But yeah, let's continue. I forgot my point.
They're literally a handful of people in most corporations. That is, your grandmother may have left you when she died 11 shares of something, but you're not a major shareholder. This may come as a shock. I don't want to upset you, but you're not a major shareholder.
All right, okay, cool. So I know what I was thinking. So he was actually talking about how most most decisions in companies are done by fucking major shareholders and people who actually, the one thing that they are, the one thing that a lot of major shareholders are rich. They're rich enough to actually buy shares and stakes. And this is what I was saying earlier, especially with the financial crash. People weren't bailed out with the financial crash. Shareholders were. And that's the key, that's the most important thing about it. It wasn't about bailing out people. It wasn't about making sure that people had enough money to get by. It was about shareholders. That's what the problem with the that's what the rescue of the financial system was. So let's continue.
A major shareholder owns millions of shares. Can be a bank, can be a wealthy person, can be a foundation. There's a variety of holders of these major shares. But it's a tiny group, 20, 50 people, groups, institutions own all the shares, except for the handful that grandmothers leave as parting gifts. And the way a corporation works, again, for those of you not familiar, once a year there's an election. And the shares vote for something called the board of directors. That's usually a group of 12 to 20 people. They're on the board of directors. If you ever wondered, some of you may have had as a career objective to become a member of a board of directors, you probably noticed that that's a good place to be, and so I'm about to tell you how to do that. You have to get elected.
So this is the thing. This is the key thing. a lot of people who are on boards of the board of directors, on the board, are other motherfucking wealthy business people. So they only do shit that would make sure that they themselves, will stay wealthy and push that fucking stock price up, even if it means destroying a company for short-sighted gains. That's why so many people want to be on a board of different companies. That's why you see so many companies actually, in some cases, straight out buying politicians because they're lobbying to be on boards of directors. The politicians, in some cases, as soon as they leave fucking politics, they go to be on boards, or they leave a board to go be on to run political campaigns. I'm looking at you, Deval Patrick, and they make decisions that enrich themselves, but not the fucking country. But let's continue.
By the shareholders. That's how everybody got there. Once a year, the shareholders have a vote, and here's how the vote works. You get one vote for every share you own. So if your grandmother left you 11 shares, you get 11 votes. If you are Chase Manhattan Bank and you own, for your various accounts, 27 million shares, then the vice president you send to the annual meeting of the shareholders votes to 20 million shares. You could think that you're just like him, but you understand you're not. If 1% of the people own the bulk of the shares, that's the 1% who decide all these elections. And that's indeed how it normally works. So the 12 or 15 people that are on the board of directors, they make the decisions. Sometimes with more influence from the major shareholders if they muddle in there, sometimes with less. But it really doesn't matter, because even if you add together the 15 to 20 individuals who are on the board of directors to the 10 or 20 or 30 individuals who are major shareholders, those people, that 50 people, more or less, make all of the key decisions for every corporation that works like this, which is 99% of them. Let me be clear with you so we all are on the same page.
Kill them.
This board of directors decides what the company produces, what objects are made, what services and goods are produced. Number two, how they will be produced, what technology will be used. Number three, where the production will take place. And finally, what to do with the profits that all of this work generates. This board of directors and the major shareholders make all those decisions. Those are the key decisions any enterprise ever makes.
So, and this is the thing. This is why I'm one of those people who believe that in reality, we should actually have, if a company is big enough, and like I said, this is one of the plans, ironically, that I like from Warren, is that a company is big enough to be a multi tens of millions of dollars company, you should have 50% of your board be frontline employees, the people who actually are on the front line, and people who understand the bottom parts of the business versus some, we're gonna say nice, out of touch people. We're gonna be nice, some out of touch people who may not understand the full ramifications of a business. But let's continue.
Meanwhile, there is a large number of people, 500, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, hundreds of thousands, millions, who are employees of the corporation. They all, of course, have to live with the decisions that the board of directors and the major shareholders make. Well, let's give you an example. We're going to close this factory or office here in New York, and we're going to move it to China. Have a nice day. Or We're going to substitute these machines for these working people and lay them off. Have a nice day. We're going to take the profits to which the labor of all the employees contributed, and we're going to decide to use it for an advertising budget or beautiful new shrubbery outside the main office or whatever it is we want, because that's who we are. We make the decision. Who's the we? The board of directors, 15 to 20 people, and the major shareholders, another 20, 30 people.
And see, this is what makes capitalism so fucking destructive. Because you get these people who live in their own motherfucking bubble, and we all fucking do. We all live in our bubble. But where it is that everything... This is why Hillary Clinton lost. Because she was in a bubble where everything was okay. And yet it's still so many people were suffering. I would say that for me, because I'm in the Chicagoland area, and 2016 is when the Cubs won the World Series. And to be honest with you, when I saw that, I got scared because I saw how many people that were regular fucking fans and how they banded together for their fucking team. So I was a little bit worried with Donald Trump, because the fact is, you see so many people that are hurting, that are willing to come together for a loser team. Okay, Sox fan hate, I know. But this is why we need more people who are workers in these boardrooms, because, and not people who have graduated up to it, because I don't want to make any presumptions, but to be honest with you, if you're willing to elevate yourself so far high up in a lot of these corporations, even if it means hurting people, usually you are not a really good person. And I'm not saying that everybody who makes it up there is bad, but usually those aren't good people. But let's continue.
Marx finds this intriguing, and so do I. This is an interesting way to make the fundamental economic decisions of a society. Because what you are essentially doing and saying, whether you face up to it or not as a culture, is that there's going to be a tiny group of people who make all the key decisions that everybody else has to live from, on, and with. But now to drive the point home, the mass of people, the employees to begin with, but the larger community in which every corporation lives and functions, they all have to live with the consequences. But they are excluded from participating in making the decision. Let me say that again to make real sure it's with us. The mass of people in our economic system are required to live with the consequences of the decisions made by the corporate leaderships, decisions from which they are excluded legally and in practice, de jure and de facto. Whatever else you call this system, it is not democratic. In the communities where we live, we insist upon having votes. We say that the mayor or the governor or the senator or the president makes decisions that we all have to live with, and therefore we, who have to live with the decisions, must be able to participate in making them.
Fun fact, at first you couldn't directly elect a senator. So people who wanted to be senators used to be able to petition the governor in order to become senators, and that didn't happen. That didn't stay long. Or it stayed long enough. God. Getting people the right to vote and making sure that, the government works for the people, perish the thought, right? But let's continue.
But when we go to work in a capitalist system, we cross the threshold into the office, the store, or the factory, and we put all of that aside. We don't demand it, we don't require it, and we don't have it. Now back to Marx. Herein, in that situation I just described summarily for you, Marx said, lies the reason why capitalism, despite its hopes and dreams of the people who brought us capitalism, that it would usher in liberty, equality, fraternity, has proven itself unable to do that. Because it turns out, Marx argues, that if you put the power of directing what goes on in an economy in the hands of a tiny number of people, you can't really be surprised if they make the decisions that keeps them in that charmed place. Can you? So why are we surprised to learn, as I'm sure many of you know, that over the last 40 years, for example, here in the United States, just to take an example, corporations, boards of directors, and major shareholders have decided to take the profits that everyone helped to produce. By the way, you know how we know that everyone helps to produce the profits? You know how that happens. That happens every year, the proof of it, at the Christmas party. That's when the...
So, and I'm going to let him go. I'm going to let him continue on this. But this is actually really, really interesting because when you actually see this, it's how many people actually just go into work unquestioned because the first thing that you hear, well, it's their company, they can do what the fuck they want. Like, literally, I hear that so much. And it's just like, but you complain about government regulations or things of that nature. But you let this company who has no real authority but the authority that you give them, the ability to set and, tell you what to do because you need a job. But let's continue.
Chief executive, a little wobbly from too much punch, gets up on a chair and thanks everybody for the contribution every person in this firm made to our successful year. And then having thanked you, the chairman and the other members of the board go off and decide what to do with what you kindly helped to produce. So it shouldn't come as a surprise if the last 40 years turns out that what has happened is that those corporations, those boards of directors and major shareholders decided to take a huge part of the profits that were earned and give it to themselves in the form of dividends to shareholders, which is what they are, and spectacular pay packages to the chief executives who are on boards of directors. This should surprise nobody.
So, and here's the thing with that. This is what this is a trick that they have actually done to have us believe that these people know what the fuck they're doing because they're rich and successful. The only thing they did was set themselves up. They set themselves up to milk the system. There are so many people who are on boards of companies that they get elected to be CEOs of other different companies that have failed in, oh my God, who is that? Carly, whatever, the woman who ran for president, and her claim to fame was that she helped with HP. She was fired because it was some sort of incompetence. But she was on the board and she was able to run for president. And even when she failed at that, she went to become CEO at another motherfucking company. That's ooh. not EA. Yeah, no, Bobby Kotick is Activision. But the president of EA, who says we should charge more for than the $60 for games, he was laughed the fuck out of the room. But because he was on the board of another company, he failed upwards. Yet and still, people who work and do wage labor for a living, they're fucking criticized for if they lost their job for one specific thing, then it's their fault, and you should have been a better employee, and you should have bowed your head a little bit better, and it's like, what the fuck, man? You get these fucking losers who effectively only did one thing, and they bought their way to a position where they can reinforce their dominance through money, and they're not that smarter than anyone. They may be a little bit sociopathic, a little bit more sociopathic than other people, but they're not smarter than the regular frontline employees. They're not. But let's continue.
But let's take some other examples that are remarkable. Corporations have decided, and Google is an important player in this,
He just
to
keep
do
giving
what
shots
we
to
call in
Google.
economics automation. Over the last 30, 40 years, we have really replaced huge numbers of jobs that people hold by computers and robots. It's very interesting. That is driven by profit. The boards of directors calculate, they bring in economists like me, and they calculate what we would pay for workers and all the versus what it would cost to buy and maintain these computers, these robots, whatever the automation form is. And they make the decision based on what's better for their profits, because that's how corporations work. That's what they do. And then they make an interesting decision. If the machinery is more profitable, they buy it, they install it, and they turn to the workers and they say, "You're fired, have a nice day." And those workers go off and have maybe a nice day.
So this is another key thing, and like I said, man, this takes balls, and Google hasn't taken it off because they probably think, oh, he's just being Professor Wolff. Like, when I say that it is like, one, corporations' high holy belief in the algorithm is like the best thing going. It's one, scary because they're putting the algorithm over, and by in turn, just like Professor Wolff says, they're putting profits over people, and they're okay with losing public image if it means that they save money on, purchasing the algorithm. And I get it. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you very much. If you haven't, follow me on, that's Facebook. Thank you. But Google in particular, and fucking Facebook, and I'm using them. I'm not gonna lie, I'm using them. But they figured, let's have algorithms actually go through and flag things. Now, it's great that we have learning algorithms and things of that nature. It's great. I will say that it is beneficial to have a technology where things are improving. But when you only rely on that, when you only rely on an algorithm, this AI or learning AI, a lot of times things falls through the crack, and maybe there is a problem such as following law. Hello, Google. That was set up in the 1990s. Hello, FTC. But it takes a person to go through because machines can't understand context. Hello, Google and FTC. And this motherfucker is about to start fucking with me. I am not the one, dog. You do not want this fight, man. See, you even more dead. But let's continue.
Probably not. They're fired. They're unemployed. Hey, we have no idea. I take that back. We do know what happens to them. In stunning numbers, they get depressed. They get sick. They start desperately looking for jobs. If they don't find them pretty soon, they start being willing to accept jobs that they are overtrained for, jobs they are underpaid for, etc., etc. They may get angry. They may do violent things. The social costs of all of this are staggering and always have been. But that's none of the problem of the corporation.
So, and this is what, God, like, this is why I have empathy to people who are incels. And this is why. Not because they in a lot of cases are pieces of shit who actually blame their problem on somebody not wanting to sleep with them. But that's what they have been tricked to believe. Now, I'm not saying that you need money to have a relationship with your chosen people that you want to have a relationship with. But it's part of the status. It's part of the idea that, well, I have this status as a man, and I'm going to use a template for most incels. They feel that they're sufficient because they are a man, and what they feel is that they, people respect them with the right woman, and they want to be rich and have, like, be beating women off with a stick. And yeah, I know the analogies somewhat work, but they want to actually have this whole idea. And part of that idea is that they've been sold is that you get rich, you get a woman, and then you'll feel like you've accomplished things. You feel like you have done things. When in reality, a good majority of the reasons why people feel that they haven't accomplished things is because they feel the struggle, they feel the uneasiness that comes along with this capitalist system of saying that if you're not on top, then there's something fucking wrong with you. And the way you are determined to be on top is either through having a lot of sexual partners actually wanted to spend time with you, or a lot of money. And that programming has inevitably hurt so many people. But let's continue.
It bears in a capitalist system no responsibility for that at all. If there are costs of laying all those people off, those are the problems of those people and of their friends and relatives, neighbors, and the communities in which they live to struggle with as best they can. Marx says this is really interesting because in many situations, it's easy to show, don't need to be a Marxist for that the social costs of the unemployed are much larger than the profits gained by the private corporations who made the decision to fire these people. But because the private corporations got the profit without having to pay the cost, it was profitable for them, even though it was socially an unprofitable move to make. It's the way the system works. Okay, now let's put it all together. Marx argues that leaving things in the hands of the capitalist corporation, and you can see now why a bit more government intervention or a bit less is really beside the point. Because with more or less government intervention, you're not changing the basic way the capitalist enterprise is organized, with a tiny group of people making all the key decisions and doing so in a way that replicates their situation, understandably, and unfortunately replicates that of everybody else, too, along the way. In fact, let's even push it further, as Marxists should. If the government doesn't just regulate, but let's suppose the government goes a step further, fires all the private boards of directors, takes the property away from the shareholders, and says this is now a government enterprise, and then puts into the board of directors not individuals elected by shareholders, they're all gone, but officials designated by the state apparatus. You 20 people will now run this factory. That's a little bit like what happened in the Soviet Union in 1917. That didn't work out too well either. And why? Because it didn't change the internal structure of that enterprise. Yes, instead of privately elected people, as in private capitalism, they had state officials.
So, and this is the key thing, and this is where you have to look at the failures of socialism to actually understand what would benefit not only just the people, but the corporations too. In the Soviet Union and in a, how do I put it? There are other countries across the world, in China, in the other Eastern Asian countries, where there are more socialist leaning. It is where you just have state capitalism, and that state capitalism has led to the same tyranny that you would have with regular capitalism. It's just the state is behind it. And I remember watching a debate where Professor Wolff was talking about it, and he was saying that, and the guy, he was actually Gene Esting, or no, I'm sorry, it was somebody. He was saying that it's evil because the government killed their own people, instead of saying it was just evil because the government killed people, because he knew that, like, in the end, capitalism does kill other people. It actually hurts other people. It just doesn't kill their own people. In some cases, I'm not even gonna say most, but let's continue.
Interesting change, but that doesn't change the fundamental problem. And Marx pointed to that as the issue. The way this is organized is fundamentally antagonistic to ever getting liberty, equality, or fraternity, or democracy, if that's what you're interested in. Now, this is a very powerful way of analyzing things. But Marx was a very sophisticated thinker and wanted to drive it home on the most intimate way that one can, by looking very closely at the employer-employee relationship. And again, this is an elaborate piece of work he did that takes some time to work through, and I'm going to give you a heroic short summary, but I think you'll understand it real well.
How long have I? Oh, I've been 30 minutes, yeah.
Let's start with the employee who's looking for a job. Could be me, could be you. And you go and you meet an employer who's got a job. And you sit down and you discuss it. And the employer explains you're to come, Monday through Friday at 8:30, and you stay till 4:30, or whatever it is. You'll sit over there, you'll do work with this machine on that piece of paper, whatever it is. And then you get to that touchy point. How much are you going to get paid? And to make my example very simple, let's just use the number $20 an hour. You're going to be paid $20 an hour for whatever it is you just came to work. At that point, Marx says, let's stop the film, stop the whole thing, and let's be clear about what happens here, because everybody kind of knows it, and yet hasn't faced it. And I give you a heroic short,
Sorry,
whatever it
guys.
is, and then you get to that touchy point. How much are you going to get paid? And to make my example very simple, let's just use the number 20 bucks an hour. You're going to be paid $20 an hour for whatever it is you just came to work. At that point, Marx says, let's stop the film, stop the whole thing, and let's be clear about what happens here, because everybody kind of knows it and yet hasn't faced it.
So, if your employer is paying you $20 an hour, there is almost a guarantee that he's making at least $60 to $100 an hour off of your labor. I'm spoiling the fun. And when you think about that, when you think about, damn, this motherfucker is getting over on me, it kind of makes you pissed off. I know it makes me pissed off, and it makes me real pissed off. But let's continue.
And I suspect that's still true. Having been a professor of economics for 50 years helps you to get a sense of whether it's true or not. You know, Marx makes it very clear, but you know what I'm about to say. That the only reason any employer will ever give you $20 for an hour of your work is this. That hour, adding you to whatever the payroll already is, hiring you, in that hour, you're going to make more goods or services for that company to sell than they would have if they didn't hire you. They know that. That's why they're hiring you. You're either going to make a better quantity or a better quality of whatever it is they produce. And the company's calculation is, it is worth it for me to hire you for $20 if and only if the extra hour of your labor will yield to me, the employer, more than $20 worth of extra output for me to sell. If it doesn't, I won't hire you because it would be absurd. I would give you $20, you'd work for an hour, I'd sell the results of your extra work for $19, and I'd be down $1. I got an MBA, I know that's not good, I'm not going to do that. But this has enormous implications. First of all, and this is tough on Americans, it means that if you've spent a lifetime telling yourself you're never going to work for anybody who doesn't pay you what you're worth, I've got real bad news for you. That never happened, and it never will. That kind of statement to yourself is your way of avoiding to deal with the system in which you live. And I feel for you. You need help, but not the kind I provide. You live in a system in which the basis of the corporation is that difference.
So, and this is where, I kind of push back on a lot of people who I've heard over the years say, well, be your own boss. You don't have to listen to somebody else. And it's just like, I don't know if people actually realize the stranglehold that a lot of corporations have used their power and money to influence. We actually see companies buying a de facto monopoly. Like let's just talk about the Disney issue in the room. They literally have a de facto monopoly when it comes to movie studios. And that they designed that because they were always looking for profits to increase their corporate shares. But let's continue.
Or to use Marx's language, the worker produces a surplus over what he gets. And that's the name of the system, is to get it and to accumulate it. Wow. So what have we got in capitalism? We've got a system that has delivered us two extraordinary qualities. It has delivered us stunning instability. I always use the same joke at this point in what I present. If you lived with a person as unstable as this economic system, you would have moved out long ago. In 1929, it crashes. Crash lasts 11 years. In 2008, it crashes. We're still in it. For those of you who don't know, there's an agency in the United States called the National Bureau of Economic Research, which keeps track of the business cycle, is a polite term we call for instability. Between the end of the Great Depression, 1941, and the beginning of what we're in now, 2008, there were 11 more economic downturns. Every president of the United States has been a president over a downturn. That's how unstable the system is. And every president has promised during the downturn that if we just do whatever the things are he thinks we ought to do, we will overcome that crisis, overcome that downturn, and never have another one. Every president promised it. No president has ever delivered on this promise. That's why we're in one now. They all promised. They can't do it. The system's instability has been with it from the beginning. We average an economic downturn every 4 to 7 years in capitalism. For 300 years, no matter where capitalism has come to, that is what it brings with it. Keynesian economics was an attempt to cope with it. Didn't work out.
So, this is where we're going to leave it here, and this is what we're going to work on Monday. I'm going to be playing Smite. I'm going to be doing Smite on Monday with Monday Night Smite, and we're going to actually continue this, bring this back. Bring this over here.